Please welcome the panel on Happiness and Sustainability, Changing Our Approach to Growth, moderated by Senior Director of Research at the Milken Institute, Maggie Switek.
Bunch of people eating breakfast.
They are having breakfast.
Huh?
So hello everybody, thank you very much for being here with us today for our panel about happiness and sustainability, changing our approach to growth. We have an amazing panel of experts with us here today, and just for logistics, there's a little QR code that is going to be appearing, so please feel free to submit your questions throughout the session. So without further ado, let's start. I'll just begin by providing some context, and then I will pass it on to you for the discussion, of course. So why does happiness play a role in sustainability? So we have been here since yesterday talking a lot about sustainability from the perspective of environment and how the modern approach that we have to growth is really exhausting. It's exhausting our resources, our natural resources. But the one natural resource that we haven't really spoken much about is us, humans. And the type of approach that we have to growth right now is also exhausting to us, to humans. And how do I know this? Well, every year, since 2013, there has been a report that's called the World Happiness Report that is published by a number of economists, including Richard Leyer and Jeffrey Sachs. And in that report, they provide a ranking of over 100 of countries in terms of happiness. This year, for the first time since the start of the report in 2013, the US dropped out of the top 20. And why did that happen? That happened because of the low well-being of its young population. So if we think about all of the population, the US was ranked as number 23. If we consider only the population below the age of 30, it was ranked number 62. And so we clearly have a situation in which this type of growth is exhausting us. It's especially exhausting to our young population. And so thinking about sustainability, it's really important to also look at the human-centric perspective of sustainability. So having said all that, let me start off with you, Jen. So you're the human sustainability human sustainability leader at Deloitte. And so in that role, how do you define human sustainability, and how do you view its importance in our society now?
Yeah, thank you. So human sustainability really recognizes that human well-being is inextricably linked to the well-being of the planet, of our economy, and our social and cultural systems. And it, at the core, kind of emphasizes this need to approach a balanced view of economic growth, environmental sustainability, while at the same time, caring for the social and psychosocial needs of the humans in our society. And when you bring that to a workplace setting, it really is looking at kind of how do we change the dynamics of the employer-employee relationship from one that has largely kind of traditionally been very transactional to one that is about value creation, that is about organizations and leaders creating work and work environments that don't harm the humans, kind of in terms of unsafe and unfair work environments, unsustainable workloads, many of the things that probably many of us are either experiencing or hearing about the workplace today, and kind of creates a more virtuous cycle of this relationship between the employer and the employee. Now, that said, this is a pretty big paradigm shift from kind of where we've been historically and how we think about the role, responsibility, and purpose of governments and of businesses, to your point, to become one that is not solely focused on growth at all costs, because a lot of those costs our human cost. And we're seeing that kind of play out before us in the World Happiness Report, but in so many other aspects of our lives.
Yes, so speaking about that shift in paradigm and precisely growth and economic growth, let me move on to you. Mariano, you're a professor of economics. So as economists, we like growth. So as an economist, how do you view the human limits to growth and the importance of considering subjective well-being, human well-being in that sense?
Yes, we are used to talk about environmental limits to grow. And that's the idea that we are asking too much of the planet. We are asking too much in terms of resources, degradation of the environment, and so on. But we are forgetting that we are also asking too much of human beings, of people. And it's about us, it's about who we are. We are not superheroes. We are used to watch movies where superheroes do a lot of things, and they always survive, and they are always have strength. After 2 or 3 falls, they keep going on, no? But we are humans, and evolution designed us. It's a long process of evolution, and we are designed for some things, but not for the accelerated way of life, not for losing our roots, that means our friends, or family bonds. And when there are some kinds of economic growth that threaten the pillars of what we are and of our happiness. And those kinds of economic growth are those that displace people. When you tell somebody, look, you are more productive 2,000 miles away from here, and then you are moving there tomorrow or next month, it's not only about productivity, it's about a whole family that is asked to be moved, or a parent that moves and kids grow alone somewhere else, no, with their mothers. When we say, look, we are globalizing, and then we don't know if next year we will have a contract or it will be a company from China or from other parts of the world who will have the contract, that implies vulnerability. And that means that people get anxious about the future. You don't have that stability that you need in life. So there are some kinds of economic growth that threaten human beings in terms of their well-being. That's what we call the human limits to economic growth. It's grow, but not grow at any cost. It's focusing on people rather than on affluence. Affluence is an instrument, and we can use growth to buy what is important for happiness in life. No? We can use growth to buy leisure. We can use growth to buy stability, safety. And also it is about how we generate growth. What kind of growth contributes the most? It's not just focusing on whether we are growing at 5% or 7%, it's how we get there. Are we getting there sustaining families or destroying families? Moving people or creating communities? And for communities, we need people to stay there in a long-lasting relationship. So we need to think more about how we use growth and how we create growth, economic growth, and to connect this with happiness.
Yes.
That's about the human limits to economic growth.
So speaking of, Mariano, you mentioned the importance of focusing on people, really. So speaking of people, Robert, you're a professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. And in your role, you're also the director of the study of adult development. And that is an amazing study that has been tracking people for over 80 years now. And what has really that taught you about precisely what are the factors that contribute to human well-being and the role of the society in general in that?
Well, this is, as you say, it's the longest study of the same people that's ever been done. It started in 1938, and with 724 families, a few of our original folks are still living. They're over 100. and we've studied all their children. And what we found was really about people that first of all, we did find that if you take care of your physical health, it matters hugely for well-being. But we also found that the people who lived the longest and stayed the healthiest were the people who were most connected to other people throughout their lives and had the warmest connections with others. And at first we didn't believe our own data because we thought, how could your relationships actually get into your body and shape your physical health? But many other studies have begun to find the same thing. So now we really understand that social connections are tremendously powerful for well-being. And when our folks got to be 80 years old, we decided we would ask them, what are you proudest of as you look back on your life? And these were some very prominent people. John F. Kennedy was in the study. Obviously, he didn't live to be 80, but Ben Bradley, who was the longtime editor of the Washington Post, many of these people were quite prominent. When we asked them what they were proudest of looking back, not one person talked about their accomplishments at work, the awards they'd won. Not one person talked about how much money they had made or how famous they had become. Everybody talked about people. I was a good boss. I was a good partner. I was a good colleague. I was a good parent. Everybody emphasized the personal connections as they looked back on what really meant the most to them. And then what we found as we watched people age was that people who aged in a happy, healthy way were the people who maintained social connections or replaced social connections when they lost them, perhaps during retirement. And so what we've come to understand is that social connections are the kind of single variable that's hidden in plain sight as perhaps the strongest driver of human well-being.
Yes. So your study looks a lot at the effects of aging. So Hal, I know you do a lot of work about precisely the trade-offs between the present and the future and the importance of having an integrated perspective on time. Yeah. So what does your research tell you about precisely what kind of decisions lead to better life, and also what are the factors that affect that decision making throughout a person's life cycle?
Yeah. So first off, thank you for organizing this, Maggie. So my work is really focused on looking at how people connect to their future selves. And one of the things that we've found is that oftentimes many people think of their future selves as if they are other people entirely. And when we've looked at people over time, not as long as what Bob has looked at, but over like a 10-year period. One of the things we find is that the people who experience the best outcomes in life, the people who've saved the most, who take care of their health, who experience more life satisfaction, are the ones who experience a close emotional bond with their future selves. In other words, it's okay to think of our future selves as if they're other people, but what matters is the emotional link that we have to those other people. And so, I think about sort of the connections of some of the things that we're talking about here. And, many of these decisions that relate to well-being and happiness boil down to my tendency to lean into the present or take a step back and think about the ways that I might act now in favor of my future self, or rather, not just in favor of it, but how to balance out the two. So I think there's always this conversation, especially in psychology and economics, about trade-offs, about the delay of gratification and present bias, all these things that mean that we sort of lean into the present and don't think about the future. But I don't think it has to be so black and white. Oftentimes, I think some of the best outcomes are the ones where people recognize that they can experience both trade-offs and balance, where they can live for today and also do things for the future. And so I think that's one of the real challenges right now of policymakers and academics and economists alike.
Yes. So speaking of trade-offs, there's oftentimes when we think about happiness and human development, we think about the trade-off of investing in work or leisure time and versus work time. So in finance versus versus connections, to put it that way. So, and this, many times what we end up thinking is that happiness is really a rich country problem. You know, once we have satisfied all of our fundamental needs, then we can think perhaps about social connections and happiness in the broader sense. So all of this really stems from our perspective about the Maslow hierarchy of needs and the way that our physiological needs need to be satisfied before our social connection needs, the fact that it needs to be sequential. I know, Mariano, you have done some work about that. So would you like to talk about the validity of that approach, of the sequential approach to Maslow's hierarchy of needs?
Yes, it's amazing how Maslow's pyramid is like an icon. Everybody knows that. All my students know the pyramid. And there is something deceiving there. You have this idea that you go sequentially, satisfying needs, and that you have to finish satisfying completely your physiological needs before you move to the next one. And it's like climbing a ladder and expecting that when you get up at the top, now you have full fulfillment, realization, and so on. But we ran a study to know who were more satisfied with life. And what needs were satisfied by these people. And we found out that what is really important for life satisfaction is not physiological needs, it's not self-realization, it's basically love and belonging.
Yes.
And that's very important. People who satisfy their love and belonging are very satisfied with life. And you don't need to satisfy completely your physiological needs before moving up. No, actually, there is a better path to life, which is to start with love and belonging, a little bit of physiological needs and esteem, more love and belonging, a little bit of self-realization, and more love and belonging. And that way, in that path, which is completely deconstructing the Maslow pyramid, you get more happiness in your life.
And that creates a little bit of an irony, right? Because I know how you talk a lot about financial constraints. And one thing that you have found is that being financially constrained affects the way that we make decisions.
Yeah.
And that it actually affects the way we decide between experiential goods and financial goods or material goods. So can you speak a little bit to that and how that interacts with what Mariano just said?
Well, first I'll add, I saw a meme on academic Twitter, which can't have that large of a following, and it was the new Maslow hierarchy of needs has Wi-Fi at the bottom, and then you build on from there. My work, and this is work that's led by Stephanie Tully, who's a professor at USC. We looked at financial constraints, but one thing to note is that financial constraints aren't necessarily objective. Mm-hmm. So you can make a lot of money and still feel financially constrained, yes. Like if you live in LA or Miami. Or you can feel financially constrained because you objectively don't make that much money. One thing that we know from the literature on psychology and marketing is that, and I think anybody who's a good millennial in the room will know, that the type of purchases that make us happiest are experiential purchases. There's almost become sort of a zeitgeist that we need to focus our spending on experiences. And I think that plays into, experiences often connect us to other people, which I think plays right into, what you're talking about. Nonetheless, so much of that work has looked at not necessarily the full spectrum of financial well-being, financial constraints, and financial abundance. What we found in this project led by Steph Tully was that when people are financially constrained, or when they feel financially constrained, they often opt for a material purchase over experiential ones. Because if you don't know, or you're insecure about where your next dollar comes from, oftentimes people would rather have a physical thing. Mm-hmm. They'll know that they'll have that in the next time period, rather than an experience. Now, the irony is that economists have suggested, experiences afford us many different types of utility. We've got the anticipatory utility, we think about it in advance. We get the online utility when it's happening, and then the retrospective We can look back at the experiences. It may be the case that if I'm financially constrained, I don't pay attention to the possibility of the retrospective utility and instead pay attention to what thing might I have. Now, whether that's a mistake or not, I think is unknown. But I do think it's the type of question for future researchers and policymakers alike to say, well, what sort of purchases do afford the most well-being and happiness along the income spectrum, and which ones should we promote for which different groups of people? I don't think it's a one-size-fits-all type of problem.
Yes. So, and the idea there is also that the experiential goods are the ones that help us perhaps make connections with people and build communities. So this is one thing that I think most of you have said now, the importance of communities. So Bob, let me go to you and ask you, how can we build communities that provide the level of social connection that we want to have?
Well, it's interesting because, as you started to say, we think about, our social lives as existing at home and not at work. And community isn't at work. Community is what I do when I'm done with work. And many of you know the Gallup organization that does really good workplace well-being work. And they did a survey of 15 million workers around the world. And one of their primary questions was, do you have a best friend at work? Yeah. And what they meant by that was, is there anybody at work that you can talk to about your personal life? My kid's having trouble with their homework, or my mother's becoming demented, or whatever it might be. Do you have somebody you can talk to? Only 30% of the 15 million workers said they had a friend at work. But those 30% were more engaged with customers. They were better performers. This is rated by bosses and colleagues. They were less likely to get injured on the job. They were less likely to leave the workplace for another opportunity because they had people they wanted to show up for. And those 70% of workers who said they didn't have anybody they could talk to about themselves, only 1 in 12 said that they were actually engaged in their jobs. And that 11 out of 12 said that they were more or less checked out of work. They were just phoning it in. And the other thing the Gallup organization found was that half of CEOs, half of leaders said that they felt lonely much or all of the day at work. So I think when we're talking about creating community, one of the places that's often overlooked is the workplace. And there are absolutely techniques that people are using and that organizations are using to structure workplaces to make it more likely that people will develop friendships because those organizations realize that the bottom line improves in their organization if people have friends there.
Yes. So, Jen, this really talks to what you work in.
Yeah.
So what can you tell us about the role that precisely employers play in creating communities, and also what are the type of programs they can implement to make sure that these communities are created?
Yeah, I think it is absolutely essential for workplaces and leaders to really consider the workplace a bedrock, a foundational source in our society, especially in our modern society, of creating connection and belonging, because we're living, most of us, or many of us are living in a world where some of the more traditional ways that we used to find connection and belonging have fallen away. And I think a lot of us experienced what that feels like, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic. And so, I think that is an essential component of, or needs to be an essential component of any workplace strategy. I think where we are today, no one has quite, everybody recognizes the need. I don't know that we've quite figured out what the answer is, and that's why you're seeing kind of these swings back and forth of, everybody's going into the office, no one's going into the office, we're all going into the office Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, or some combination of that. I think part of the problem or the fallacy, there's nothing wrong with wanting to gather people together in the workplace. The messaging, in my view, is a little bit off in that the messaging right now is around leaders believing that people are more productive when they're in the office. And Bob, to your point, yes, they probably are more productive, but the reason they're more productive is because they are co-located and co-mingling and spending time face-to-face with other human beings. And so I think that workplace would potentially do a lot better at getting people to want to come together a little bit more or a little bit more often if the messaging was around human connection and the value and the importance of human connection, especially in a society when many of us, and certainly as we probably have all heard, many of our young people are feeling very, very, very lonely. That's not to say that the research is proving out that flexibility is also incredibly important in the modern workplace, and especially for certain populations of people that have other responsibilities and duties outside of the workplace, as for caregivers and things like that. And so we do need to find this balance, if you will, as to what is the role that the workplace plays and why, and have the focus be more human-centric on why it's better for the humans and not necessarily a message around kind of productivity and decoupling those. For those of you that might have read the article and the pamphlet that you got from Milken, there's kind of a movement and a lot of discussion going on about decoupling productivity from humans, from people, because productivity is a measure of output of machines, and especially for those that are knowledge workers, is being in 13 back-to-back calls in a day actually productive, or does that prevent you from doing good and meaningful work, and what is valuable work for humans to be doing? So those are the types of things that I think workplaces broadly need to be and are grappling with, but I don't know that we have yet figured out the exact right solution or set of solutions, because I'm not sure that there, to your point, is a one-size-fits-all on that.
Yes, so speaking precisely of productivity and outcomes, how do you observe the effects of precisely creating communities on the outcomes in the workplace? So because many people will be thinking, well, yes, but there's a bottom line, right? I really want the bottom line to add up. So what have you seen about the effect of precisely investing in workers' well-being on the bottom line?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the data is very clear, and probably my colleagues are better at speaking to the data, because I'm awful when it comes to speaking to data. But what I will also say is that on a very human level, you see it and you feel it. It's we all know what belonging in community feels like. We also know what belonging in community doesn't feel like. And that does cause, significant levels of disengagement, like the Gallup report was saying. I mean, having one best friend at work, having that outlet, having that person that you can go to, that you feel seen and heard, that's what we all want as human beings. And when you strip that from the workplace, I think all of us have had that experience, and so we know what it feels like. But there are certainly bottom line impacts, bottom line measurements. Gallup, all of these gentlemen have done incredible research and have found incredible data. But what I will say is that there's a lot of discussion right now about employee surveys and annual surveys and sentiment surveys, and are they worth it? Do they work? Do they matter? I think the debate is still out. I'd love to hear all of your thoughts on that. But I do think that it is important to understand from your workforce how things are going. But I think an annual once-a-year survey kind of tells you nothing. It tells you what's going on at a point in time, perhaps. And if I had a bad day or a bad week, the survey that I take is going to reflect that bad day or bad week, and not the experience that I had throughout the entire year. And so I do think that some of the newer models and newer approaches of kind of always on, now that we have this technology that's available to us, I think there needs to be work done to really enhance the trust between the employer and the employee. And that's where some of the work around human sustainability comes in, because if you enhance and increase the trust, you're going to get better data to understand how your workforce is doing and what their needs are, and then you'll be able to directly address those as opposed to some of these blanket programs, tools, and resources that may or may not be scratching the itch of the workforce.
Yes, Mariana, I saw.
Yeah, I would like to add that probably we need a sense of this idea of community. We need to understand that as unconditional acceptance. And that's usually what you get in another kind of relationships, the family relationships, family bonds. It's a place, and I remember Cheers. Some people here may remember Cheers. It's a place you go where everybody knows your name, no?
Yeah.
Where is it where everybody knows your name? It's not in a bar. Cheers was very nice, but it's in the family. It's when you go and you have your uncles, your cousins, your brothers, sisters, and they know you as a person, not as a worker, not as a client, not as a customer, but they know you as a person. Since you were a kid, and some people say, what is the longest relationship you will have in your life? Probably with your brothers, your sisters, no? They know you since you were born, and they will be accompanying you the whole life. So the family provides those kind of relationships that also satisfy love and belonging, but it provides a framework to understand community as a place where you go and feel accepted, independently of what happens with your life. Sometimes you are messing your life, but you get accepted in the family. That's something we need to expand when we talk about the idea of community. We need communities, not cities. You have a lot of people, lonely people, in a big community like LA. No, what we need is people meeting in that sense, knowing each other, accepting each other, and going together through life, in the journey of life with other people. I think in the future we are facing major threats, environmental threats, mental health threats, drug consumption threats, and we need to go together. And I usually say how little kids in kindergarten face the major threats when they go to cross the street. That's a major threat for a 5-year-old kid. How do they cross the street when they face the major threat in their life? They go hand in hand.
Yes.
And we need to build that, to go together. Yesterday they were talking about polarization, and I think that building a sense of community is what is needed. There are many policies at the municipality level. You can have more public activities. We need to rescue that public space. Public space is not only the main square in the city. The public space is where people gather together, know each other, know that they are persons like the one they have in front, and go through life together.
Bob, I saw you wanted to.
Yeah, if I could take us back to your question, Maggie, about, well, how do you measure this? Because this can all feel real feely-touchy, right? And there are a lot of skeptics it's particularly in the commercial world, in the business world. So they do measure this. Besides the Gallup work that I talked about, there was a study that came out of the Sloan School at MIT, where they did an actual experiment. They composed different teams comprised of all kinds of different types of workers. They gave them all the same task to accomplish, and it was a complex task. And what they did was they actually videotaped how the teams functioned, what their meetings looked like, and then they had people come in and rate them. And what they found was that there were certain teams that accomplished this task much more efficiently and worked together much better than other teams. So what were those teams? Well, the teams were teams where 1 or 2 people did not dominate and suck all the oxygen out of the room, that there was much more equal airtime, that there was a sense that team members were genuinely interested in differences of opinion and in each other. It was not the team where members had the highest IQ, but it was the teams where members had the highest emotional intelligence, the best people skills as rated on other measures. And after all this was taken into account, they also found that the teams that had more women on them also did better. So, just saying. And the reason why I say that is that it is possible to run real-world experiments where you figure out how do these variables actually play out in terms of work productivity. Yeah.
No, and so a lot of this goes back to the difference between what we call subjective data as opposed to objective data. We have mentioned surveys here a number of times. I know in the audience we will have a lot of business leaders, financial people from the financial sector, and so we always are used to liking really hard data. But what can you what can you say about the importance of survey data, subjective data? Go ahead.
It's funny, when I teach some of these topics to my MBAs, I always get a core group that looks quizzically. They're often the former engineers or the ones who are going into finance. And they say, well, these measures, they're not objective. Mm-hmm. And I heard an analogy a while ago. Maybe the rest of us have heard this. That if you go to the eye doctor, there's no objective measure of what are the right glasses for you. They ask you what feels right, and they try different ones on. That's a subjective measure, but it's meaningful. In the same way that there are subjective measures of happiness that are meaningful. If I tell you I'm happy, you know this better than I do. It means a lot. It relates to my marital satisfaction. It relates to my productivity at work and how likely I am or not likely I am to have suicidal ideation. But I think it's important to note that there's many flavors of these subjective measures. We've been talking about well-being, and that's a big, broad construct. There's happiness, which is more fleeting. There's meaning and purpose, which are more longer term and longer lasting. And there's been interesting research, some of which I've been involved in, saying these are different things. The best analogy or the best description of this, when we were about to have our first kid, one of my colleagues, I said, I know the data, and I know that my happiness is going to take a hit. And he looked at me and he was like, screw that data. You need to recognize that happiness is composed of many colors, and that what we think of as happiness may not necessarily be the same throughout our lifespans. Right. And throughout our days, and as a function of culture and our workplace and whatnot. And so I think it's really important to recognize that there are so many different measures that tap into these constructs of well-being, all of which have different relationships to other outputs. And yes, some of them are subjective, but man, I think we need to pay attention to them because they're meaningful.
There is one more recent objective study that came out of the Oxford Center for Wellbeing Research. Jan Emmanuel Deneuve and his team did do a pretty large study on the workplace, especially, and workplaces that focus on well-being of the workforce, providing not just the right culture, but the right benefits, tools, and resources. And they were able to show that those companies, their stock performance did go up over time. And so if you need a hard financial objective measure, that is a great study to reference.
So I guess we can pair them up, and the outcome is going to be the same, so we like that. Mariano, go ahead.
No, there is a study by Gallup that was in Egypt and Tunis, and that study shows that GDP going up, and Mubarak, who was the president of Egypt, probably saying, I'm doing great, no? Because look, the GDP is going up. But Gallup is measuring also life satisfaction, and life satisfaction was going down. And that was before that revolution in Egypt, no? If you focus too much on objective data like the GDP, you are missing the important point that it's about people.
Yes.
It's about how they feel in life. And that's what subjectivity brings to this research. It brings people and allows us to start talking about people-centered development. Not GDP-centered development, but people-centered. It's not that we are discarding GDP, but now we can use GDP to provide happiness rather than GDP to increase GDP by itself.
Yes, and we see that over and over again, right? There's also studies looking at subjective well-being, life satisfaction in China, as China had grown a lot in the past decades, and we don't see life satisfaction going up in the same way. Go ahead, Bob. I see you want to go.
Well, and often it's because of what you were saying, Mariano. It's because as GDP goes up, as countries develop, social networks get disrupted. Yeah. So in China, for example, there's economic opportunity in the big cities. So younger people move to the big cities. That's where they marry. They have their kids. The grandparents are no longer in charge of raising children in the villages because the children are not there. They're having their kids elsewhere. The young parents don't have the help that they're used to having, and the kids don't have the joy of being doted on by grandparents. And so, and this is happening in India. There are many, many cultures in which essentially economic development has negative effects on family cohesion and then collective well-being.
So let's talk about policies, but before we do that, I'm being told to remind everybody to submit your questions through the QR code. We will go into questions in just a little bit. But before we do, let's continue this conversation about policies. So what policies could we really establish to strengthen communities? As opposed to just focusing on growth, what do we focus on?
Can I just say one thing here?
Of course, go ahead.
I think it's important to note that these are conversations we've been having for a long time. So, I mean, Robert Kennedy, the original Robert Kennedy, back in the 60s, he had this quote where he said, GDP measures everything except for that which is most meaningful in life.
Yes.
Right? And it's like we're having the same conversation now, which is really, it's fascinating to me that something like 60 years later.
And frustrating, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Mariano?
No, I think we need to make better use of income, of GDP. Now that we know that income or GDP is not an end in itself, but a mean for something else, we can start studying how to use income to generate better well-being. And as I said, we need to buy more leisure. We need to use income to buy leisure and use leisure to nurture relationships. That's a better way of using income than purchasing new clothes or new cars. No? Buy leisure and use leisure for relationships. We need to invest in this idea of community building. At the municipality level, there is a lot of actions that you can take, to create groups, to create activities, community activities. Even urban design. We need cities where people walk. And I'm very clear, I know I'm saying this in LA, but we need density in the cities. People should walk, should meet other people, have parks, green areas to interact. Not get in the car, drive 60 miles, get down, and go back in the night. No, you need to interact, and that's creating public space. We need also to focus on the effects of some economic growth strategies that are destroying families. Families are very important, and uprooting people from their backgrounds. You are missing your friends, your family, because you are moving, relocating. We need to be careful with those policies that promote growth. And governments may expand the palette of options to increase happiness. For example, in Mexico, we have what we call a neighborhood campaign. And then we have somebody who goes there and builds community at the neighborhood in low-income solutions, household solutions. It's not about having a roof, it's about having neighbors you can talk with. So there are many policies we can implement.
I saw both Bob and Hal. You wanted to jump in. Bob, go ahead.
Well, there are some specific things, some very concrete things that people have done in workplaces that actually work, because, we're talking about a lot of general principles, and it can feel like, well, how would you actually do this? So I'm thinking of our Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy, and he did something in his staff meetings where he did this on Zoom, and he also does it in person, where the first 5 to 10 minutes of his weekly staff meeting, one staff member talks about something personal, something in their life. It could be something happy, unhappy, could be a hobby, could be anything, just something you'd like the rest of the group to know about. And actually, when they thought about eliminating that part of the meeting, everybody said, no, you can't eliminate it. It was by far the favorite part of the meeting. And what it would do is it would spark all these offline conversations. Oh, I didn't realize you had the same hobby that I do, or whatever it might be. And so what I think is that sometimes we can end up offering these general principles that feel unworkable when it comes down to real world activities. But I think that there are some best practices that we can implement that are small changes, but that can have big ripple effects among workplace populations.
Yeah. So I'll add to that, because I think it's so important to think about these specifics. If you think about, this is a proposal from Laura Carstensen, who is my mentor. You think about the model of retirement, you think about pensions and Social Security. This was created back when life expectancy was a lot shorter than it is now. Now, people can live, and we know this on this panel, people can live much longer. And so now you're spending this huge portion of your life in retirement. We've already heard that family and social connections are so important, and yet we have this model where people are grinding through those periods where they're, in theory, having the most time that they could spend with their families. So, a radical proposal is switch some of the retirement years earlier and take people out of the workforce and almost use Social Security to fund them then. That's almost too radical. It's not going to happen. What about a step down?
I like it, though.
It might, but what about a step down and saying, can we have policies and workforces that encourage longer sabbaticals early on when there is that period of time where you can connect? And then, maybe it means workers have to work longer, but in terms of life expectancy and health span, 65 is literally the new 55. So it's not like we're working when we're frail and old, but rather we can continue to work longer and then have those years built in as a buffer earlier on. But there's gradations of that. Yeah.
And I do think that you're starting to see some policies, not in the US, but in Europe and other places around the right to disconnect that are specifically related to the workplace and the overwhelm and kind of the overwork that the workforce is feeling. And so the right to disconnect, for those of you that don't know, is a law that basically says that after, I believe, 6 p.m., you are not required and can't be punished in any way for not responding to work-related emails and messages. And so you're seeing those bubble up in other countries. I think the move towards the 4-day work week is also kind of another sentiment of how the workforce is feeling. Now, will that solve all of the workforce's problems? And is a 4-day work week better or worse for some people? There's a lot of debate on those. But I do think that those are kind of the beginnings and the bubbling up of, okay, there's a recognition that at least the way that we're working isn't pro-social for people, and we're spending more time grinding at work than we are developing personal relationships and social connection, and that's really affecting people both mentally and physically. And so I think those are kind of some early bubblings up of where policy could go in this regard, but I do think that it's a sign that it's needed and wanted by the workforce.
And speaking about the workplace, I do want to get some of these questions in. So in the global conference, we have been talking a lot about AI this year. And so I have a question here about what capacity do you think AI has to change our relationship with work? And what will it take for those changes to happen? Does anyone want to speak?
And what was the last part? What?
What will it take for those changes to happen? But how will AI change our relationship with work, and how can that affect well-being?
I'm happy to start with a point of view. Look, I think that as with any new technology, we have the opportunity to use AI to really enhance us as humans and the work that we do in the workforce. We've been talking about the difference between, well-being and happiness and meaning and purpose. If AI, can and will be doing the tasks that are more automated, that allow humans then to do more meaningful human work, that give humans the time and the space to actually connect with one another on a human level. I think that's a very positive use case for AI. Now, there's been a lot of talk at this conference about productivity and AI. And so, yes, there's a use case that AI will make workplaces in general more productive, but what do we do then with that free time for the humans? Is it that we then pile on a whole bunch of other non-meaningful, non-valuable work that then keeps them in a place of stress and overwhelm and burnout and scarcity? Or do we then use that time in a more human way? I also have a real fear that the excitement around AI is currently seen as a way to cut costs, and cut costs with the human expense, because the humans are the biggest cost in the workplace. And so I think there's a real risk of us going down that path, and that will ultimately, from a future perspective, a long-term perspective, be bad for humans and bad for the society and bad for the economy.
I'm sorry, Bob.
No, go ahead.
I'll just say that I'll take a slightly different approach, which is there are now researchers who are using AI to create essentially like little worlds. You can think of like the Sims game, but now it's populated not based on like my avatar, but rather like like almost a little society based on real people. And you could then use AI to run simulations to see how different interventions, different workplace strategies will affect those people, given that they're based on, think of it as like a large language model, but for behavior. And so, rather than testing out, saying, well, let's try this strategy at this meeting, and see how it works, you could actually run simulations and see like, how do these little AI agents, I feel like in 10 years I'm going to look back on this and say this sounded ridiculous, but say like, how does a given intervention impact this group of people in this AI simulation? Yeah. And then you have more insight going into an actual intervention in the workplace, which I think will just be a fascinating use case for AI. Sorry, Bob, I know you were.
Well, I'm a psychiatrist, so I think a lot about mental health. And one of the things that AI is being tested for now is to figure out whether it can detect when somebody's in trouble. So think about one of the problems with people struggling with a mental health disorder is that they often don't reach out. They become more isolated. But what we're learning is that there's certain frequencies of our voices that change if we're depressed or if we're anxious, that there are certain frequencies with which we use words or phrases that can signal that we're in trouble. So one of the things that AI may be used for in the near future is figuring out when a colleague in a workplace is having trouble, or when a family member is having trouble, and prompting us to reach out, those of us who have the energy when the person who's struggling gets more and more withdrawn.
So a lot of this also brings us back to how can we use AI to create more time, to take less pressure off of humans, to create more time for humans. So I have actually two questions here that are somewhat connected. One is about whether we have any evidence of shorter work weeks, like 35-hour work weeks, for example, or more sabbatical time, whether we have any evidence of that actually increasing well-being. And the other question that we have here is about how do we balance the importance of workers to belong in the workplace with their need for work-life balance. So they're somehow connected because they both go to the work-life balance question. So does anybody want to speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, I can speak to it. There's certainly evidence. There's a big study on the 4-day work week with Microsoft, I think, out of Japan. And there's some more recent studies. You can kind of follow 4-day work week global. They've been doing a lot of studies. I recognize that they're the organization that's pushing the 4-day work week. But look, I mean, my view is there's evidence to show that it is working and creating better well-being outcomes for people in the workplace. That said, I think that it is incumbent upon organizations and leaders to figure out what works for their organization. I could see in my role and in my life, trying to cram all of the work that I need to do in 4 days being more stressful for me versus saying, hey, you're an adult, you're a professional, there's 7 days in a week. You figure it out, and that's when you get into, is productivity really this measure of output versus outcomes? And we hire people to do a job, we hire professionals to do a job, and if they're getting their job done, that's the appropriate outcome, not when they did it or how they did it or necessarily even where they did it. So again, but there are certainly workplaces and types of work that I think would benefit greatly from a 4-day work week. What I also think that needs to happen with a 4-day work week is there needs to be a real kind of hard look at the work that we're doing, because work needs to be redesigned. We can't just tell people that are working 50, 60-hour work weeks, okay, now you have 40 hours, get all the same amount of work done in the same way. It doesn't work that way. And so we need to look at what is value add. And I do think that AI potentially could meet the need to create a 4-day work week if that's the direction that people wanted to go. But I think there's a lot of other answers that we haven't quite figured out. But there is a lot of data that is showing that sabbaticals, time away from work, extended periods away from work, 4-day work weeks, things like that give people the permission, quite frankly, to pause and to step away. You and I were talking yesterday about, taking vacation and checking our email while on vacation. There's evidence that shows that, your brain needs to disconnect in order to come back refreshed, in order to be creative and innovative. And if we're constantly connected, we're constantly on, we're constantly worried about what's going on back at the proverbial office, it is not just hurting our own health and well-being, but our ability to truly be creative and innovative. And so there has to be a better balance than where we are now. But all of those things are showing positive human outcomes.
I would like to add that the benefits extend beyond the person herself.
Yeah.
Sometimes when you have family, I'll go back to family, you have little kids and they need their parents, their presence of their parents, not growing alone, not coming to home and nobody's there. So those benefits sometimes are not measured in these surveys, but we know from attachment theory, nurturing, that it's very important for these kids to grow up with the presence of parents. And when both parents are working 5-6 days per week, who is there not just to feed the kids, but to nurture them, to make them citizens, good parents in the future, good citizens. We need that perspective of that free time allows us to connect with the next generations also. We have a problem of intergenerational connectedness now.
Well, and just to your point, we do have good data about family leave policies. So both from the Scandinavian countries that have very generous family leave policies by law, and some companies that are very good about family leave for both partners, right? And they have tremendous positive effects, not just on the workers, but obviously on the families, and then that feeds back to the workers, because if the workers are able to be home and take care of what they need to, then they are freer to devote their attention again to the workplace and not always be divided in their sense of loyalty. So family leave is one place where I think we can trot out the data and show to people who are making policy about this.
Yes, so that really takes us back full circle to the importance of also younger generations and the type of approaches to work, approaches to growth that really could enhance the well-being of the younger generations, especially as we see them deteriorating. Well, that pretty much takes up the time that we have, but I do want to thank the entire panel and thank you all for submitting your questions. This has been a fascinating conversation. So
Thank you, Maggie.
yeah.
Thank you, Megan.